Hey guys, I'm back, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about the top 5 scariest Ben 10 villains. Because if this video releases when I think it's supposed to, then it's officially Halloween, making this the perfect time to talk about scary Ben 10 villains. With that out of the way, let's jump straight into the list at number 5.
Upgrade complete.
One of these days I plan to talk about Malware as a villain in his own separate video, but for now I just want to focus on how terrifying of a character Malware is, and how easily he earned his spot on this list. I mean, he's so scary that even 16-year-old Ben was scared when he first re-encountered him, showing just how much he managed to psychologically scar Ben as a child, which already kind of tells you just how scary of a villain he is, to have left psychological damage on Ben Tennyson, the guy who went up against Vilgax and doesn't even flinch when he sees him again in Alien Force or Omniverse. But that's not even the scariest part of Malware. The truly terrifying part about Malware is his origin. He was born as a defective and deformed mechamorph, who unlike the other mechamorphs, instead of upgrading and mimicking technology, could actually create it out of his own body. Unfortunately, his condition also made him extremely angry, and kept him in a state of extreme pain. His origin mimics that of Frankenstein the monster, but unlike Frankenstein, he doesn't want to be a normal person, or in his case, a normal mechamorph. No, he hates the other mechamorphs and sees them as inferior to himself, and hates the fact that Azimuth sees him as the flawed one. This hatred of his own kind and his hatred towards Azimuth leads him to actually destroying all of the mechamorphs at one point, along with the previously mentioned psychological scarring of Ben when he tried to get the Omnitrix just to mess with Azimuth. His hatred, anger, and unpredictable nature makes him truly terrifying. Despite just how short-lived he was, he managed to leave a huge impact in this series. The only reason Malware isn't higher is because, like I said, he was sadly very short-lived in this series, whereas a lot of the other villains on this list had entire episodes and seasons to become truly horrifying villains. Who could possibly be more terrifying than Malware, I hear you asking? Well, there are a few villains, but the one at number 4 has to be my favorite one, so let's not waste any more time in getting to him. On to number 4.
Oh, if they thought I was a freak before, just wait.
By this point, I think most people know how I feel about the classic series Kevin. He's perhaps one of the darkest villains ever introduced in Ben 10. His origin of running away from home and being stuck in the streets of New York, while also being ostracized due to his strange powers and bullied constantly by the other people around him, is already a fairly dark origin story for a villain, but it's what results of all this trauma that makes Kevin truly interesting to me. Kevin becomes vengeful and spiteful towards other people, and in the episode Framed, begins to attack random civilians who have done nothing wrong to him, or even know him. In the episode Framed, Kevin becomes a monster, both literally due to his powers freaking out on him and turning him into a crazy amalgamation of all of Ben's aliens, but he also figuratively becomes a monster, someone who hurts people for really no good reason other than to make themselves feel better, and who justifies it to themselves in the most terrible of ways. By the end of Framed, Kevin has more in common with monsters like Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees, and far less in common with Ben, a kid his own age, showing just how much he's changed from his initial episode. And it's this change that makes Kevin so terrifying in my opinion. At the end of season 2, we see Kevin team up and betray Vilgax, who up till this point has been perhaps the most terrifying Ben 10 villain ever. This to me was Kevin's Joker moment, as he basically leaves Ben and Gwen to die at the hands of Vilgax while he goes and conquers all of Earth, showing us, the audience, just how cruel and sadistic he has become. It's honestly kinda unsettling rewatching Kevin's episodes as an adult and thinking through the implications of his actions and all the off-screen deaths that he might have caused because of those actions. And while the later series versions of Kevin weren't as scary, that's mostly because they kinda couldn't be, because he was kind of supposed to be a good guy there, and not a horrible monster like he was in the classic series. I take issue with this change, as I'm sure you all know, but ultimately it doesn't take away from the absolute monster that Kevin was in the classic series. But it does stop him from being at number 2 or 1 like he probably should be. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the third scariest Ben 10 villain, Dr. Victor.
You will not stop me, boy. Even with your pitiful array of weakling aliens.
That's right, I'm putting Dr. Victor at number 3. I know this probably seems like a strange choice to some people, especially when you consider the fact that Dr. Victor had at most like 10 appearances throughout all of the Ben 10 shows, but I think that only serves to highlight just how good of a villain he was in his initial debut back in 2005, or I guess technically 2007. In his initial debut episode, Dr. Victor is honestly terrifying, as he tries to kill Ben and his family at numerous points throughout the episode. True, he's not as sadistic about messing with the Tennysons as Malware and Kevin are, but that's also why I find him scarier. He's all business. He's only killing the Tennysons because they might interfere with his plan. It's kind of the difference between Lex Luthor and the Joker. One is so chaotic and crazy you can't help but be scared of him, but the other is so meticulous in planning, you're always wondering if he has some sort of plan to kill you in the back of his head. That, coupled along with Dr. Victor's voice and great design, really helps him stand out and seem scarier than the other Ben 10 villains in this season, like the Werewolf and Mummy. And along with all that, like I mentioned earlier, he is completely fine with killing a 10-year-old child. Like, look at his reaction when he thinks Ben is actually dead. He's smiling. He doesn't even hate Ben that much. They literally only just met in this two-parter, and yet he's smiling at the fact that he just murdered him. Even Vilgax didn't take joy out of harming Ben. He just didn't care what happened to him as long as he got the watch. And like I said earlier, Dr. Victor doesn't even hate Ben that much. He only did this because Ben kept messing with his plans. I find his hatred of Ben, because he might interfere with his plan, pretty terrifying. Because remember, Dr. Victor really doesn't care that much about the Tennysons. He's only upset at them for what they did to Ghost Freak, and even then he's willing to abandon the search for Ben entirely. He really has no reason to hate Ben that much. Vilgax, Ghost Freak, Kevin, and Malware all had pretty good reasons for hating Ben, and for taking joy out of hurting him, but Dr. Victor really doesn't, and that's kind of the scary part. Imagine if he did hate Ben for more than just interfering with his plans, like Ben had personally wronged him and he had been out for revenge. What kind of sadistic torture plan would he have come up with? And all that's not even getting into his powers, which he has complete mastery of and is extremely proficient in, making him deadly to all of Ben's aliens. Overall, I just find Dr. Victor to be a truly scary villain. Maybe not in the same way that Kevin and Malware was, but in his own unique way that I actually find better than those two. The only reason he's at 3 is because of his OV interpretation, which took away all of the menace and scariness that Dr. Victor had in the original series. But still, for the short time that he was in Classic, he was pretty scary. So who could be scarier than him? Let's go on to number 2 to find out.
Then drain their positive energy like a sponge at a pool party.
Zombozo really doesn't need much of a reason to be on this list. His first episode pretty much cemented him as one of the scariest Ben 10 villains ever. He's like a combination of all the villains I've talked to up till this point. He's got the sadistic, cruel nature of Kevin, he scarred Ben as a young child before Malware ever got a chance, and he had the same business-like mindset / sociopathic mindset that Dr. Victor had when it comes to draining people's happiness. I really don't have that much to say here. I would just recommend you go check out the episode Last Laugh, because in that episode, he's pretty much the ultimate threat to the Tennysons up till that point. He kidnaps Gwen, leaves Grandpa Max a laughing mess that can't help Ben at all, and psychologically scars Ben with probably one of the most visually amazing sequences in the entirety of Ben 10. And for once, the writers didn't completely ruin Zombozo in the later series. True, his UA interpretation is pretty bad, but it's still creepy and unsettling, especially when you see him kidnap Gwen's mom and put her on a tightrope. And the OV interpretation is also pretty good, as they acknowledge the fact that Zombozo isn't as scary anymore, which makes the source of his powers drain, which is kind of a unique fourth wall break, acknowledging the fact that villains usually get less scary the more we see of them, and thus makes them less interesting / less compelling to watch on screen as an audience. Case in point, Vilgax and all of the later Ben 10 series after the first one, at least before the reboot. Before we move on to number 1, I also just want to highlight how unique Zombozo's powers are. Unlike in most shows and movies, his powers never feel generic. He steals people's happiness and uses it to create these crazy hallucinations, and in OV he turns people into zombies by having chattering teeth bite them, which turns them into weird versions of himself. I don't know, it's just always more unique when villains have a sort of unique power that isn't really seen in many other series, which is also why I'm glad they never bothered to explain how he got his powers. I know some people are always talking about how he should be a magic user or a technology user, or how it was a plot hole that they didn't mention it, but I always found that made him more scarier, as you never really knew what he was doing, so the fear was always there, which is why even to this day when I rewatch The Last Laugh, I get unsettled by what Zombozo is doing. I felt it important to highlight all this before we move on to number 1, and speaking of which, let's move on to the scariest villain in every single Ben 10 series. I don't think I'm surprising anyone with this pick. We all knew Ghost Freak was going to be number 1. His voice, design, personality, and powers all make him perhaps the scariest Ben 10 villain in any version of this show. I know I've used the word sadistic a few times throughout this video, but Ghost Freak's personality is truly the embodiment of the word. He takes great joy out of harming others and at harming Ben at any chance he can get, and sees their interaction as a kind of game between the two, a kind of perverse inverse of Ben's attitude towards a lot of his fights. Except Ghost Freak doesn't stop fighting until the person he's fighting is completely subjugated to his will. He does this by using his powers, which allow him to possess another person's body and mind and take control of them completely, which is already pretty terrifying. But the way this happens on screen is also pretty scary, as we see Ghost Freak take possession of them and move their bodies unnaturally, their eyes becoming dark hollow slits much like his, which is a great way to make him scarier and make his power set more unique. And speaking of which, those powers are what allowed him to exist in the first place. Ghost Freak used to be an alien in the watch that Ben would transform into, but every time he did, he would always feel a little off. Like there was something unnatural about the Ghost Freak transformation. And in the season 2 episode Ghost Freak Out, we learn why that is. It turns out Ghost Freak's species is able to exist within even a single strand of DNA, which allowed Ghost Freak to escape the watch in the previously mentioned Ghost Freaked Out episode. Because his species holds their whole memories and being inside their DNA, every time Ben became him, Ghost Freak knew about it and made him unironically be possessed by a 10-year-old child much the same way he possesses people, which drove him mad, and the second he got out he tried to get revenge on Ben by doing the very same to him. And like I mentioned, Ghost Freak kept this scariness throughout all of his interpretations throughout the series. Sure, not all of them were very accurate like his Alien Force appearance, but even there he was still scary and intimidating, having taken over a whole planet full of Chimera, the species that Vilgax rules over, and using them to build ships so he can extend his rule throughout the entire universe. Generic, yes, but still very, very scary. Even his OV interpretation, the most child-friendly version of the show before the reboot, still managed to be pretty scary with this plan to take over all of the Anur system and the rest of the universe. And it also gave us the great reveal of his real name, Ziskar, which is a pretty scary name for a pretty scary villain. That, alongside the backstory that he's actually a high Ecto Lord, made a lot of his actions not only make more sense, but seem even more terrifying. The fact that he already had control over a whole universe, and yet still decided to take over Ben's planet just to mess with him. It's like I said in the beginning, pretty much every aspect of Ghost Freak is scary, and that's why I put him here at number 1. And with that, I'm gonna bring this Halloween special video to a close. Which villains did you find scariest in Ben 10? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll see you guys soon, I promise. Hope you enjoyed and make sure you subscribe for more videos.